All right, y'all. So I'm going to give you all a little bit of a review for our test that's going to be coming up tomorrow on Egypt. So let's look at it real quickly. I don't want to do this all day. I know you don't want to watch it all day. So let's first look at maps and geography. What makes Egypt important is the Nile River. The Nile River is the longest river in the planet. It's pretty awesome. And what makes it so awesome, and here's a map. Let me zoom in there. What's letter C there, you're going to see a map very similar to this on your test. Right there in letter C, that's about where Egypt is. And the Nile River, you can see that clearly on the map. This big old long line that goes all the way down the map, all the way down the continent of Africa. Nice thing about this river is when it rained, the rain rained at the southern part of Africa, and so it was very easy to predict when the Nile River was going to flood. When the Nile River floods, it brings all the silt out, and the silt's brought up from the river, and it covers the land around it, makes it very fertile for farming, and then everything around that, outside of that, is just covered in desert. So most people lived very close to the river because that's where you're going to get water. The river is called the giver of life. The Nile River is given that name because it gives life. It brings food to the people of Egypt through farming. Because of this, the Pharaoh was a smart guy, and he says, hey, I can predict when it's going to flood because, well, all he had to do was pay attention to when it's rained in the southern part of the Nile River, and then he would know when it was about to flood in the northern part of the Nile River, because remember, the Nile flows to the north, flows up to the Mediterranean Sea, and when it flows, the Egyptian Pharaoh was able to figure this out and was able to tell everybody that he could predict when it was going to flood, and then everyone wanted to follow him. Because of that, the Egyptian Pharaoh was convinced people that he was so powerful that he could control the seas, that he can control the rain, that he can control everything, and that makes him like a god, right? So if we're going to treat him like a god, then this makes him believe that he is the god, or makes him pretend that he's the god, and he believed that he was the god Horus, who was the god Horus embodied the Pharaoh. So when we talk about their government, imagine what it would be like to live in a government where the god, where the person in charge was or believed that they were God. Imagine our President Obama, being like, yo, I am the God, and then I'm going to tell you what to do. And he comes out and makes a proclamation and says, everybody, what we're going to do now is you're going to follow my rules, and you have to follow every rule that he says. Well, the Pharaoh ruled with a very tight and iron fist in a way where he says, you got to do what I say. But unfortunately, because he was viewed as a god, he also had to take the blame for anything bad that happened. So, but he's still the Pharaoh. He's still a god. And everyone looks at him like that lived in ancient Egypt. When we talk about their language, the Egyptian language was created with hieroglyphics. And hieroglyphics were unique. Remember, we talked about cuneiform in the previous unit of Mesopotamia. Well, cuneiform was just symbols that represented words, entire words. They had tons of symbols. Imagine every single word that we use in the English language. We have over 1 million words in the English language. Imagine having to learn a character for every single word. Well, that would be a lot. Well, in ancient Egypt, they had about 700 different characters that represented entire words and that represented sounds. So it's almost like a mixture of this ancient cuneiform where everything has a different symbol for a different word and a different symbol that represents a different sound. So their hieroglyphics are just pictures that represent these different things. And we did this in class where you got to create your own name. And hieroglyphics are seen in lots of different places throughout Egyptian culture. And I can show you a picture of it right here on your book that I have in my class. You can see all that writing on the temple, inside this temple. That is different types of hieroglyphics. Okay, innovations, when they created a number of different things, engineering being a cool one, where engineering is basically figuring out a way to make your life easier, taking things that exist and making them work better for you. So one thing that they did was create the pyramids. They also looked at the moon to figure out the lunar calendar. And their calendar wasn't accurate. It wasn't 100% accurate because the moon's cycle is a little bit different than a solar cycle. But still, they're starting to divide up their days or divide up their year by a calendar. They also came up with basic math, which they had to use to be able to build a bunch of stuff. They also had very primitive medicines, and were the people that we know of that first started using castor oil. If you don't know what castor oil is used for, then think back to what we talked about in class about my granny making me drink it when I was sick, and talk to your parents. They might remember those things. Most people don't really use that anymore because we don't really use castor oil, but that is a remedy that has been used for centuries now, really for millenniums, because it's been around since about 2000 BC. So their religion, remember the leader of their religion was, who was it? It was the Pharaoh. And so since the Pharaoh is the leader of the religion, what we see is that the Pharaoh himself is the man. He's like one of the gods of many gods. And when you worship many gods, you remember what that's called? That is called polytheism. Poly means more than one. As opposed to monotheism. Monotheism means only one. We've only learned about one religion that was a monotheistic religion, and that is Judaism. This polytheism, they worship a bunch of different gods, and their gods are kind of funky because their gods are walking around and they got like a head of a lion or the head of a bird or a head of a whatever, and then their body is usually the body of a human. Remember, you can look up on YouTube the horrible histories and look up horrible histories Egyptian gods, and you can see the gods about the devourer and the god Osiris, and you can see the different gods that they worshipped in Egypt. Okay, art and architecture, their biggest thing that they created was, well, the pyramids. And I gave you many theories of how the pyramids got here. I've got kind of a cruddy picture of it here, but the pyramids, you know what the pyramids are, so I'm not going to show you this awful picture, but we made some in class and we saw how difficult that was to make our paper pyramids. Well, pyramids can be difficult to make, and the Egyptians proved how awesome they are at making them. The pyramids exactly line up to north, east, south, and west. So north, east, south, and west. So it's amazing the technological feat that they were able to do. The precise measurements were way beyond the capabilities of many humans for years to come. It's unsure how those pyramids were made the way they were. It's also unsure how they had the technology that they had to create them, but we're still figuring that out. Let's see, they also created a lot of their hieroglyphics are kind of viewed as art, but really you don't really remember the Egyptians for their artistic contributions other than like their sculptures. But most people weren't like, hey, I'm a sculptor, I want to sculpt something because I love it. Well, Egyptian art was a big deal because what they did is they created this amazing stuff that was used to kind of worship the gods, worship their king, worship or their pharaoh. A lot of their art and artwork that's still left over usually is religious in nature because that was surrounded their world. They also believed in this idea of the afterlife, which was also a very important part about their art and architecture, or their art rather. And that kind of goes back to religion. I kind of skipped that part about mummification and the afterlife. They believe that once you die, that your body, that your Ka, hangs out with you, and if you're awesome, then you get to go down and hang out in the underworld. And remember, we talked about how the underworld was ruled by Osiris. Well, Osiris is a pretty nice guy, right? Remember, we read that wonderful myth about him, and Osiris was really kind, and you wanted to go to the underworld. It's not like the underworld we think of as of heaven and hell, but a different type of underworld, an underworld of just a place where bodies go. If you were causing problems and you had a bad life, a lot of Egyptians believed that your body was stuck to your literal body, that your Ka was stuck to your literal body. So that's why a lot of Egyptian pharaohs, when they are buried in these tombs, remember the tombs, the temples, the pyramids are nothing more than a burial site. So these pyramids were filled with all this stuff so that the pharaohs would have something for the afterlife, everything that they needed for the afterlife. Okay? Trade. Trade is what we talked about, how that creates wealth, not through war, but through peace. People love it when you give them something that they want and you give them and they give you something that they want. People love to be recognized. So when I go up to you and be like, yo, what you got is awesome, I want it, And then you look at me and you say, well, what you got is awesome, and I want it. Well, we make a trade. Well, Egyptians were able to create a lot of wealth through trade, through controlling the seas. They were able to control parts of the Mediterranean Sea. They were able to control the trade on the Nile River, and this created a lot of wealth through them. We mentioned a lady named Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut brought this idea, and what she did was pretty awesome. So Hatshepsut was able to build a lot of stuff through creating trade. And it kind of makes sense that she'd be the one to do it, because when you really think about it, traditionally men are warriors and women are not warriors. So it makes sense that if Hatshepsut, being the first queen to rule Upper and Lower Egypt, which was unique in itself, if she did this, it would make sense that she would not want to go to war. It makes sense that she would want to find another way, just through cultural beliefs of the differences between men and women, that they're not going to go to war. So Hatshepsut didn't. I hope that's not offensive that I said that, but it's just the truth. So, and then the last is their social order. And now the social order is divided into many different areas, but what you need to know for the class is that the Pharaoh is a big dog. He's the one in charge. He's viewed as a god. Underneath him are the people that are the nobles. Usually this would be like government leaders, would be right beneath the Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh needs some help. I mean, it's hard to do everything on your own, especially when he's like the god. So he's got to have some help. He also needs some help protecting himself and protecting those around him. So he has soldiers, and then underneath the soldiers would be the scribes. We mentioned that the scribes would be similar to like what a teacher is today, sort of. They didn't really teach people, but a scribe's main job was just to copy down facts, copy down data, copy down books, copy down anything that was important that they wanted to be remembered by, any information that they needed to keep. And usually the scribes were the only ones that were really able to read and write, because remember, they had to learn like 700 different characters in hieroglyphics. So that's a lot. All right. Underneath them would be usually the merchants, which would be the people that sell stuff. And then the artisans are the people that make the stuff that needs to be sold. And then underneath them would be the farmers. The farmers were different than farmers are today, but they did the same. In a lot of ways, they did the same thing, where they were just working the ground, working the fields. Okay. And then the slaves are down at the bottom. And usually the higher up you got, the more power you got. We showed it as a triangle. The textbook, which you don't have, I got one. Bam. There it is. Can you see it? I can see it. Let's see. There it is. So there it is. There's a little social order. There's the man at the top. We got a few more people down at the bottom. Okay? So, listen. You also should have, if you're getting this through text message, through voicemail, through email, then you should also have my question banks that you can use to study, and your study notes that you've worked on day by day, your chart notes that we've done a little bit every day. And then you can even look further into those different handouts I've given you to follow along in class every single day. So you should not have any reasons why you don't get this information, and everybody should get an A, because you got all the resources you need. So let's do this. Bam. See ya.